Hello, you're listening to IT with AC. I'm Romano Chacon. I want to thank you for listening. Today, I'm just going to jump right into the topic. We are interviewing with a CISO, and the question really is, with all that's going on and with organizations standing up remote workers, what should clients really understand about securing remote workers? All right, so James, I know that we've got a lot to cover. We'll just jump right into it. Uh,
Great.
what I wanted to talk about today is we've seen a lot of organizations kind of shift resources to set up remote workers. And software manufacturers like Avaya and Cisco, Microsoft, and hosted providers like 8x8, to name a few, have really stepped up, and they're helping businesses by leveraging their software for free. And they want to help customers move to support workers and get their business up and running. One of the challenges that keeps coming around is, since a lot of the software solutions are for collaboration, so that's voice and conferencing, what does that mean for the rest of the environment? What does it mean to set up a remote worker and uh, and let that person back into your business from a security standpoint?
Sure.
How does that scale, or what are some of the things that you think people should consider?
Sure. I mean, the thing is, for a remote home worker, I mean, like as I mentioned before, there's a multitude of items. I mean, first of all, the person, number one, has to be trained as far as understanding the types of information they have to protect. So this is the sort of thing you don't really think about it at work, but you need to realize that you can't have work, or you should try not to have work information on personal devices. Okay, so that's one of the biggest things. People very often share their machines with their children, with their wives, with their husbands, that sort of thing. Again, I get it. You shouldn't be doing that sort of thing. The most critical thing, if you're working from home in particular, is something called VPN, which is a virtual private network. It's absolutely critical that you use that. Basically, what it does is it ensures that all your internet traffic is encrypted. So especially if connected to especially if you're on a public Wi-Fi, you need to have this. So if your company has one in place, which they all should, just basically make sure that you use this. This basically will ensure that your information is kept private, or that the company's information is kept private, because when it comes to these free areas, free Wi-Fi, they're notorious for what's called man-in-the-middle type attacks, or for people basically stealing your information. So you have to ensure, for example, if you're using a personal device, is it up to date? Does it have the appropriate patches? Does it have the appropriate antivirus on it? If you're using work devices, that sort of thing is typically covered. But again, if you're working remotely, if you're using, for example, your own personal phone, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of mobile hacks that happen. Um, there's things along the lines of, again, as I mentioned, the multi-factor authentication, um, prohibiting access to company information, where you're in compromise, when you're in hotels, for example. As a general rule, when you're logging on to a public Wi-Fi, be it a cafe, a hotel, whatever, if it's something where you're going to have to put a password, generally don't use public Wi-Fi. That's sort of the general rule. If it's something that
That's a
you
good
don't
rule.
mind that other people can see, by all means, you're looking at the news, surfing the web. But again, the moment you enter a password, be it Amazon, be it Facebook, be it anything along those lines, especially work in particular, don't do it. I mean, that's sort of the general nature. I understand there are situations where you absolutely must. I get it. But in those cases, be sure to absolutely use a VPN. That's critical if you're going to be accessing your basically your employment data, or you're going to be logging into the company's network. Because the reality is, if your machine gets infected, you can infect the entire company.
I think that's a really good point. So one of those, in terms of how companies, when they start building this remote, how are they going to do it? A lot of them start from just taking their office and thinking, okay, I'm going to duplicate this at home. So
Mhm.
a lot of companies will provide the equipment. And if they provide the equipment, kind of gets out of the command center at home, right? The kids using it, your spouse or your partner's using
Right,
it, something like that.
right.
It also is one of those where, when you have that at home, having the right workspace really
Mhm.
does help to make sure that you don't have it kind of overtaking your personal space. So if
Right.
you carve that out, that's not so much a security, but it definitely helps with being a productive remote worker. So
Sure,
let's say
sure.
a company device, and if not, then the worker, the remote worker is hopefully trained with an awareness of what not to do, especially
It's
in their
critical.
browsing or something like that.
It's absolutely critical. But understand also that, for example, if the company is giving you gear, a laptop, whatever the case may be, and you're working from home, people very often think, I'm golden. I've got company gear. It's all good. The reality is, for example, at home, you got a router. Okay. The router it's basically the most important gadget you might have in your house. It checks for all incoming, outgoing traffic, basically it's a sentry to make sure that nothing dangerous comes in and nothing sensitive goes out. It controls access to your entire home Wi-Fi network, and through that, your phones, your tablets, your laptops, and everything else you might have. So with this, you have to ensure, for example, are the passwords changed? You have to change them on a regular basis. And of course, it means you have to reconnect your devices again, but it kicks off any unwelcome visitors you might have on your network. Things like keeping the firmware up to date. You have to ensure that your firmware is up to date on it. There's disabling of, there's remote access that you can disable that are very often enabled by default. Things like that should be disabled. There's a bunch of other types of protocols, things like that should be enabled and disabled. A guest network, for example, you should enable a guest network. When you have, let's say, friends that come over, very often you give your what's called your SSID. You give that information to your buddies, you give them the logon credentials, and everyone sort of does that as a, like a nicety. The reality is you shouldn't do that, because the thing is, when people have access to your network, theoretically they can have access to your files, to your settings, to work information. So they should be set up on a particular guest Wi-Fi, for example. So things along those lines that people don't really think about, that you have to ensure that you're really, really locked down if you're going to be working from home.
Okay. And so that's another component. So a lot of this can be logical, meaning software or practice, but there are physical components that can be that need to be included in this. An understanding of
Absolutely.
your router, your home router then becomes a point of access to
Absolutely.
everything into your home, but also through your laptop or your connection to work back to your office.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I wouldn't say it's as big as, let's say, a public Wi-Fi or a free Wi-Fi type area. Those are far worse. Those have a whole other, there's a whole bunch of other issues that can come into play for that. But again, if it's something at home where you have absolute control over, that by all means, you can do certain steps to safeguard the data.